Hello and welcome to another episode of a Brothers Creed podcast. We're talking about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas Brothers, and I'm Ethan.
And I'm Jared. And today we're joined by Virtuous Men podcast, Jamie and Scott, and we talk about their season that they did, their mini pod season, about the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding virtues. And it's a great mini series. Ethan and I both listened to it. We were like, man, we got to get these guys on and talk about these virtues. This is kind of like ancient wisdom here. So I would encourage everybody to go and check those out. This is just going to be an hour-ish review of those. But the whole idea is just to give you an intro to these topics and then tease you over to go listen to those because they're definitely worth a listen. So.
And these are definitely, attributes that apply to every facet of our life. I mean, everyone has heard of the 7 deadly sins before. And so this is a cool episode where we kind of interview them a little bit about their stories that they share, as well as we dive in a little bit to each one of them and share our opinions and our thoughts on each one of these sins and the opposing virtue that helps to defeat the sin.
That's right.
So it's really good.
All right, let's go ahead and dive in.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
Most valuable commodity I know of is information.
And that, my friends, is called integrity. That's called courage. Now that's the stuff leaders should be made of.
Either you're somebody or you're nobody.
You're not the devil. You're practice.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is another collaboration between the Virtuous Men and a Brothers Creed podcast. I'm Jared, and we're here with Ethan and Scott and Jamie. The whole crew's here. Welcome, guys.
Good to be back, guys.
Good to be home. Good to be home.
Always great when we get together.
Yeah, it's like every time we get together, it's just like it's like getting together for Thanksgiving.
That's right.
A masterpiece is born.
Yeah.
and tonight
I don't know about that, but
yeah, hey, it is. Tonight we're actually in a unique situation where we're all across the United States. Ethan and I are here in North Carolina. Actually, I'm South Carolina. Ethan's North Carolina. Jamie's on his van trip around the U.S. Tonight he's in San Antonio, and Jamie, Scott is, and
yeah.
then Jamie, you're in Washington, right?
I'm up in Washington State. Yeah.
So this is we've had to do across 3 different time zones to bring you this episode.
I was really hoping that one day we can get 4 time zones, so we each are in a different one. That's the next goal. So one of you has to travel really far somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, so you know.
Next time Ethan goes to Dallas for work.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Or American Samoa or something like that.
Yeah, hey, that's a good work trip. So
yeah, there you go. So
this is, we wanted to bring you guys together because you had a great mini pod series that you did. And we know that your podcast is called Virtuous Men, and you guys talk about virtues, but this was kind of an interesting mini podcast series about how the opposite of these virtues, which are almost these vices, or what are commonly known as the 7 deadly sins. And you guys did this kind of around Halloween last year, is that right?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it finished up, let's see, I think it was almost in December. Did it go through December?
I think it was
November, I think.
Mid-November, I think it was, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Loose and Unscripted at the end of November. So
yeah, we initially wanted to end it right on Halloween, but then we also do our Loose and Unscripted.
Uh-huh.
So in addition to that, because we technically consider those to be part of whatever season we do, so that kind of extended it into November.
Yeah. So for those out there, so we're going to talk about these 7 deadly sins, which are such a fascinating kind of context to think of things, and then also the sins and also their corresponding virtues. And we're going to share some clips from these guys' mini pod series. And again, this is to help you think about these things. I think they're excellent to think about. And then go check out those videos. They're absolutely great. They're usually about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes each.
Yeah, a little shorter than our feature or our full length edition of the podcast by 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're great.
And they could just be found. I mean, obviously the audio on wherever you listen to podcasts and wherever you listen to a Brothers Creed, I'm sure the Virtuous Men podcast is there as well. And just go in there. It's the last season. Is this season number 4? Is that what you guys are considering it, or is it a
Yeah,
full season?
that's a
Or
good question. We just talked about that. What do we consider the seven deadly sins? I
It's
guess it's kind of
sort of like a.
its own thing.
It's basically it's kind of like a subspecies of season. So whatever that would be.
the sin season. Let's just call it that.
okay, all right,
That's good.
the sinful season.
Yeah. I
That's
actually
beautiful.
I thought it was the 7th season because I saw 7DS, but now I'm just realizing that's 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
That's why
Yeah,
I said,
that
how's
was
episode 8 coming? But now I'm realizing that's 7 deadly sins.
yeah. That was that was my handiwork. But probably not a good idea because people are going to get confused.
Yeah. That's why
No,
I've always been. That's why I've always been against using acronyms because they're so easy to misunderstand.
Yeah. But it was really good. I mean, I was listening to it, and it's very produced very well. More of a theatrical telling of some of these of all the sins, and then stories and examples of each of the sins, and then what obviously the opposing virtue or the corresponding virtue is with that, and how to overcome those vices. So really interesting. And so let's go ahead and get into it, Jared. I think we're gonna have like a little kickoff explanation video, or not video, these are audio clips from the Virtuous Men podcast.
Yeah, let's jump in here where you guys kind of begin to describe what those virtues are.
A sin is an immoral behavior that one performs in direct opposition to virtue. For every good action, there is an evil action. For every virtue, there is a vice. Both forces work against one another in the hearts and minds of mankind for the benefit or destruction of humanity. Stories of history and fiction have clearly revealed the truth that while every man is capable of great virtue, so too is he capable of unspeakable evil. This duality was famously summarized in what is known as the 7 deadly sins, first listed by Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, and then further developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. The list highlights the key sins in human nature that ultimately lead to destruction and death.
So, epic intro.
Well, that's a good little teaser.
Love the Highland music.
Yeah, I think that one was for your was it episode 3 of Wrath, the Hatfields and McCoys, Scott?
You can probably tell by the music.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's funny when we got into this, it was I think we covered this in Loose and Unscripted, Scott. We got into doing this because I read a book called, I've got it up here, it's Dangerous Virtues. It's actually a Christian book. The subtitle is How to Follow Jesus When Evil Masquerades as Good. And that kind of whole point of the book is, nowadays it seems like things that were once considered evil are now considered good, considered virtuous. And it kind of goes through each 7 deadly sin and how they're almost thought of as good things in the present day. And then it went to kind of corresponded it with the opposing actual virtue, kind of like how we did. So that was kind of how we got into this. And we thought, well, maybe we could, I don't know, interview the author at some point. And we didn't really do that. And then it kind of dropped off and we did other things. We did the mini pod season. And then I think, Scott, you brought it up. You're like, what if we did like a mini pod kind of season of the 7 deadly sins around Halloween? And it kind of around Halloween, it was kind of perfect timing. So that's why we did that. And yeah, I think it was really fun to do. It was very different. Obviously, we're Virtuous Man. We did a whole episode of sin, but
whole season of sin.
Yeah. It gives the the other side of the coin of men who did horrific things and the consequences of them.
Yeah.
Well, I always like the saying, right? And a lot of times for me, studying examples of other people can teach us a lot about what to do and also what not to do. I think that is a very virtuous trait, and it reminds me of the quote. A couple different versions of the quote, but one of them is, a smart man learns from his own mistakes, but a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. It kind of goes
That's
along
good.
with there's another saying that says a smart man or being smart is to know that a tomato is a fruit, but being wise is knowing that it doesn't go in a fruit salad. So
Oh, that's so good.
So I think studying kind of the opposite of virtue helps us to better understand the virtue itself. And so I think this is, maybe the specific things aren't, the seven deadly sins aren't virtuous in and of themselves, but it can teach us from examples of how to be more virtuous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the first one. So the first one is
actually, I was going to say,
Jared, do you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to share one thing that I kind of looked at a little bit of the history of the seven deadly sins, or this kind of concept. And I just found the history a little bit just so interesting. You guys, in your little intro there, you kind of pick up with Pope Gregory the First, and that's when it was kind of narrowed down to 7. But actually, before that, and I'm sure you guys studied this, there was a guy named Vigarius Ponticus, and 370 A.D. around then, he came up with the 8 evil thoughts, and this was kind of the impetus of all this. At the time, it was gluttony, lust, avarice, anger, sloth, sadness, which is one that was later changed, vainglory, and pride. And so, and then later, Pope Gregory the First, in 590 A.D., around there, he rearranged them as he was writing his commentary on the Book of Job, removing sloth and adding envy. Also, he actually took out pride. He said that pride was kind of overarching over all of these. I thought that was very interesting. And then later, Thomas Aquinas in 1250 A.D., around that time frame, did this. So something that really struck me is like from 370 A.D. all the way to 1250 A.D., even all the way down to today, where you have like the movie Shazam, or that are about these deadly sins. Not that Shazam added anything meaningful to this argument, but but I did think that this ancient wisdom. I mean, that's just really what it is. It's like ancient wisdom. It's so cool, and that's why I've really like latched onto this and just was like, this is really deep. Like these virtues and vices are so deep and thoughtful. Probably because they're thousands of years old. So
and ingrained really into every facet of our existence, of our environment and our communities in different ways, for the good and for the bad.
Yeah. So anyway, that was just one tidbit I want to share. But you want to go ahead and jump in on pride, Ethan?
Yeah. So the first one, the first episode is on pride, and kind of like Jared said, this one's kind of an overarching one that I think it kind of entails into everyone. But let's go ahead and play kind of the little definition clip of pride from the episode itself, and then we'll get into kind of the example that it talks about.
All right.
Welcome to episode 1, The Pride of Jim Jones. This episode's sin is pride. Pride is the inner conviction that one's beliefs, actions, and achievements are above all others. A prideful man believes that he has all the answers, that he should not be questioned, and that those who oppose him are wrong. While a man can be proud of what he has done or achieved with a humble heart, a prideful man sees his achievements and knowledge as the only way to success and fulfillment. In the eyes of a prideful man, there is only his way and no other. One of the 20th century's most notorious examples of pride was the infamous cult leader Jim Jones. His lifelong descent into pride came to an unforgettable conclusion that still continues to confound and horrify us to this day. Due to graphic and disturbing content, this episode may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's a strong one to kick off the season with. So, Jim Jones, Scott or Jamie, do you want to kind of explain a little bit about who this was? And we don't have to get into extreme detail, but maybe kind of what made him such a prideful person.
Well, So when Jamie and I were dealing out who was going to do which sin, I ended up getting pride. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted pride, and maybe you can elaborate on this, Jamie, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I instantly thought of doing a cult leader for that virtue, or sorry, for that sin, because it's the common trait that you see in cult leaders is that they are always defined by pride, every single one of them. They are just narcissistic to their very core as human beings. And so it was a no-brainer. Like, yeah, I got to do a cult leader, and who better than the arguably the most wicked of all of them, Jim Jones. And he was like so many of them in that he he was a complicated individual, that he really was moved by human suffering, and he really was hurt by it, and he hated racism to the core. Like, that's one of the most interesting things about him, is that he really hated racism more than anything else, and he did a lot to desegregate. Indianapolis is a good example. That's where he grew up, was in the state of Indiana, and he did a lot to desegregate entire portions of that state, and which is admirable. So you look at him and you just go, what went wrong? But I mean, and like many cult leaders, he had a very troubled upbringing. He didn't have a lot of love growing up, and he was kind of left to his own devices in a lot of ways. So he was kind of an outsider from the beginning, and that either can bring out the worst in someone or help them be better. And in his case, sadly, it led to him becoming what he became.
Yeah.
And not to give away the whole story, right? But I guess a little teaser with that is this is where the saying "Don't drink the Kool-Aid" comes from, right?
Yeah.
And
although there's actually there's a little bit of a correction there. So it's often believed that it was Kool-Aid, but it was actually Flavor Aid that was used. But for whatever reason, it became known as Kool-Aid. So just a slight historical tidbit that's often neglected is that it was actually Flavor Aid and not Kool-Aid. But drink the Kool-Aid sounds a little bit, it sounds a little bit better. Sounds better rolling off the tongue.
Yeah. We're not sponsored by Kool-Aid, so we'll use Flavor Aid.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And so he was able to, through his that pride and what could have been potentially great ambition to help, was driven by that pride and, I guess, desire to constantly have approval and be correct and be right, and everything else drove him to basically convince a large amount of people to do some pretty bad things.
And that's another trait that you see in cult leaders, is that they are the term that's often used to describe a cult leader is master manipulator. And that is exactly who he was. So you have the combination of narcissism, pride, and just being very good at persuading people that you are right, that you have the answers. That's a trait that every cult leader has, because that's the thing, is that you look at the incident that happened in Jonestown, and something like that did not just happen. It's not like 900 people just chose to end their lives because he said so. I mean, there was a gradual progression of persuasion that is characteristic of all cults, is that you look at, like, the Manson family is another great example. Like, these people didn't just decide to kill 7 people out of the blue. It was it was just this constant persuasion of, follow me, I'm right, listen to me, I am the one who has access to this knowledge that you don't have, so listen to me. And they're often very good at making people feel like they belong, that they have a purpose, and that's what everybody wants in life. So when you see someone who has those qualities and can convince you that you have that within you, then yeah, you're going to follow that person. I mean, guaranteed you're going to follow them.
Yeah. So then what's the opposing or the corresponding virtue that will combat this sin?
The virtue that defeats pride is humility. And it's another one of those cases like you were talking about, Ethan, where you look at you see these virtues, and then, but very often, we can usually see a virtue pretty clearly, but sin is not always as easy to see. So when you have something that defeats that sin, it tends to be more subtle, I think. Like I think there's a phrase of evil cannot exist without good, but good does not need evil to exist. So always, so something like pride is the corruption of humility, and humility does not need pride to exist, as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah.
So, and you look at, in the case of Jim Jones or just any kind of cult leader, you can clearly see somebody with his talents, somebody who did a lot of good for people, and you can clearly see how his life and his ministry would have gone had he taken those routes as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of interesting too how pride is kind of an overarching sin that incorporates, I think, every single one of the other ones. But it's funny how the corresponding virtue of humility kind of would potentially help with any of these other sins as well. Just being humble in general is just such a a great portion of someone's creed.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think too another, especially a great thing about humility is that it's the opposite of pride in that it does not ask for the spotlight. It doesn't ask for attention, whereas pride, that's all you want. You want everyone to focus on you and how great you are, but humility has no place for the spotlight. It's just, I'm going to, allow other people to flourish, and I'm going to take a back seat if I need to. If I need to step forward, I'll do that, but I'm not going to seek it for the credit. I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So, and it's another one of those cases where you can see how they kind of are at war with one another, and it's fascinating. That was one of the fascinating things about this particular season, was looking at the opposing virtue that defeated the sin and how they're just at war with one another, and it was just a fascinating dynamic to look into.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and go to the next one. Let's do greed here. Jamie, this was one of yours, right?
That's right.
All right, let's go ahead and dive into this description here.
Welcome to episode 2, The Greed of Napoleon Bonaparte. This episode's sin is greed. Greed is an uncontrollable, unquenchable desire to acquire more of something by any means necessary. This can take on the form of material possessions like goods, money, and land. It can also involve social value, status, or power. The greed of an individual not only leads to the ultimate demise of themselves, but can directly result in the deprivation of others. The debate over how much is too much has raged throughout the centuries, leading to polarizing economic and political viewpoints. But the greed of some men sets the bar so high that few would debate its validity. One such man was Napoleon Bonaparte. In this episode, we'll explore the life of the infamous French military commander and discover how his odious desire for more led to not only his own downfall, but to the demise of one of the largest armies ever assembled, and their empire along with it.
Yeah, this is a good one. I liked all of them, but I really like this one, and you chose Napoleon. What made you choose Napoleon here?
I think I've always wanted to do something about Napoleon, and obviously, Virtuous Man, he certainly had virtues, but I think his greed and among other sins overshadow the virtue that he had. And so when we were doing this 7 deadly sins, I said, okay, I gotta do Napoleon for greed. And I had actually just listened to it's a podcast called Real Dictators. They did a whole season on Napoleon, and it's a really fascinating story. Just kind of how he came to power. It was kind of this unknown guy. He wasn't even, born in France. He was from this little island off of Italy called Corsica. And how he became French dictator is just kind of mind-boggling. And so it was such an interesting story to research and tell. And then he gets to this point where he's all powerful. Basically, he's very much basically the emperor of Europe at one point, and there's only Britain and a couple other countries, and then Russia standing in his way. And where greed comes into it is, he basically had it all, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah, and
he wanted more, and so he invades Russia, and it just goes sideways on him. And
yeah,
the army that he assembled is, I forget the number. Is something like 600,
Yep.
700,000 men,
Yeah.
and
He came
I
back with
think
like four or
only
five
maybe
thousand.
a
Yeah.
quarter. Yeah, it was less than a quarter actually made it home, and they did make it. They made it into Moscow, and we kind of go into that in the episode. The citizens of Moscow just kind of burnt the city to the ground. They're like, fine, if we lost to you guys, you guys aren't going to get it for free, so we're just going
Yeah.
to burn the place to the ground. And it was just horrible from that point on. They're trekking home in the winter, and then there's a coup,
Hmm.
and someone's trying to depose Napoleon at the same time in France. So
Yeah.
it really was his downfall. Um, and then he kind of comes back a little bit, and really fascinating historical events in that one. And I think it really does highlight the virtue of greed, of that just never being satisfied, always wanting more, even when you have more than you could have ever imagined.
Hmm. Yeah. I like.
Isn't that kind of?
Go ahead, Ethan.
I was gonna say, isn't that kind of too what in World War II? What one of the reasons why Hitler uh, basically went under was because he decided that he was going to take on the Russians
Yeah.
on the Eastern Front at the same time as he was taking on everybody else on the Western Front, and just yeah, it's just kind of you want too much too quick. Not that it was
Yeah.
a bad thing that Hitler lost, but I'm just
He
Yeah,
overestimated himself. Yeah.
Hitler decided he wanted, it was a want and a need, I think. They needed oil, and the Caucasus and Russia, they needed oil from there, so they decided to go and get it. And yeah, obviously they started far too late, and they ran into winter, and
Yeah.
fighting in Russia in winter is never
Bad
going to be a
news.
winning strategy.
No, like the Battle of Stalingrad, just
Yeah,
absolute
exactly.
fail. Yeah, actually, we did an episode on military blunders. I think it was Ethan, right? And I
yeah.
talked about that Russian invasion by Napoleon, his Russian campaign, how just absolutely awful it was. People just freezing to death and just falling on the side of the road, and just like, you better keep walking. Half of them didn't even have shoes, and they were just coming back from this triumphant victory that was just such a fail. But
that definitely staggered me whenever because we always look at each other's scripts before we start recording. And when I was reading the script that Jamie sent me, I was just, wow, like, did he seriously lose that many guys?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you can't make it. You can't make stuff like that up,
I think that one part of so obviously the virtue here is greed. One part that I was like, oh yeah, this is perfect, was when he was being crowned emperor by what was the Pope.
Yeah.
And the Pope was supposed to put the crown on his head, symbolizing this is an endowment from God. He grabs the crown, he puts it on his own head. Talk about ambition for power and authority. Like, I think that's a personification of the greed that he did it on his own, and nobody else helped him.
Yeah. I had fun with that kind of sequence, and I wanted to make it kind of, cinematic, and like this climax of, wow, this guy's just gone too far. And
I honestly looked. I was like, no way did he just do that? And I actually looked. I was like, not that I don't trust you guys, but I was like, I have to look this up because this is crazy. I didn't believe it, and so I was like, wow, that's pretty bold, man.
Yeah.
And what did he say? Did he say like
something to his brother or something?
Yeah, he turns to his brother and he whispers, "If Papa could see us now," meaning where we came from, which is legitimate. They came from nothing, and here he is being crowned Emperor of the French, in Notre Dame Cathedral by the Pope, who he didn't let crown him.
Crowned himself.
Yeah.
All right,
what
go
about
ahead.
the opposing virtue?
Oh yeah, the opposing. Yeah, go ahead.
So the opposing virtue for this one was contentment. Contentment being, it's a satisfaction with what you have, no matter whether you have a lot or a little. There's people with not a lot who are very content, and there's also people who have everything and they're never content. And so it's not something that has really anything to do with how rich you are, how much you have. It's more of a heart issue, and kind of a focus on what is really important in life. Is it seeking power, ambition, things, material wealth, or is it things like family, things like good relationships, community. Those are the things I think can make people content. And I would say without those things, it is almost impossible to be content. And I think it's because of that people like, Napoleon, he really didn't have the family structure. There's a whole story I didn't really go into with his wife, but really odd marriage. There was a lot of infidelity on both sides, and he never really had a strong family life or community. So I think I kind of paralleled that with this virtue that defeats the sin of greed as being contentment.
Awesome. Love that.
I like it. I like it. All right, so we got a couple more to get through here, but so the next one is wrath, and this one was really interesting, and actually it corresponds a little bit to well, we'll get into it too, but you guys talked about Hatfields and McCoys, and Jared and I did a whole episode on them as well, and I can really see how kind of that wrath goes back and forth. So let's play the clip.
Welcome to Episode 3, The Wrath of the Hatfields and McCoys. This episode's sin is wrath. Wrath is characterized by rash, unwise, and destructive actions brought on by anger, jealousy, or vengeance. Whether brought on by terrible injustice or minor offenses, wrath is capable of wreaking chaos and destruction like few other sins. It is blind to the truth, unwilling to compromise, and is only concerned with feelings of superiority and justice, whether warranted or not. In the eyes of a wrathful man, everything he does is justified to himself, no matter how horrible his actions may be. One of American history's most infamous examples of wrath occurred after the Civil War on the border of Kentucky and West Virginia. It was a conflict between two families whose names would be forever linked after the terrible tragedies finally came to an end. They were the Hatfields and McCoys.
There was a whole lot of killing going on between those two.
Whole lot of killing.
Just to say the least.
Over what? A pig?
A stolen hog.
That's how some people interpret it, but yeah.
Well, there was obviously a lot deeper than that, but yeah. What made you choose the Hatfields and McCoys for this one?
Well, I think when I was thinking of doing the sin of wrath, I didn't quite think of it right off the bat, but I just thought wrath. Wow, how do you encompass that? I mean, is it like? It's not the sort of thing where you think to yourself, is there a particular individual or historical figure that really stands out as personifying this sin? But then it occurred to me, well, Hatfields and McCoys, like what a perfect group of people to do, I mean, like you said, whole lot of killing on both sides of the families. And not only that, but it's just a fascinating story. I mean, you can't help but wonder why these two families hated each other so much, and also why it's gone down in history as the most famous American feud of all of them, when America is full of feuds. So the Hatfields and McCoys, that is just one of hundreds in American history, but for some reason this one has particularly stood out in the American imagination. So researching it, I just kept thinking, what is it about this one that really stands out? And it has all of those juicy elements. It has like Shakespearean mythological qualities to it that people just latch onto, like the story between Jonesy Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy. I mean, they called them the Romeo and Juliet of the Appalachians, so things like that, or that Devil Anse was like the Stonewall Jackson of the hillbilly country or something. It's just all sorts of stuff. So you can just pin mythology on this particular story. And I think stories like that they tend to kind of have resonance beyond their immediate time periods.
Yeah. One thing for me, as I was listening to you guys' episode and as we did ours, is, I mean, that wrath just was so set in, and it almost, interestingly, it's like passed down from generation to generation. It's like a generational wrath, or grudges or something like that it was kind of these two fathers of these two clans or these two families, and as people were, their children and potentially their children's children, it just was, this wrath was just instilled in them towards this other family who, to a certain extent, they were killing each other just because they felt like it was the right thing to do. And how wrath can just be, almost generational, right? It can be taught, it can be learned in the home. And that kind of made me look back and say, well, are there certain things that I'm like instilling in my children that are kind of like, things that I need to change? But yeah, interesting. So what is the opposing virtue to combat that?
The healing virtue of wrath is patience. And I distinctly remember Jamie and I were talking about this particularly, and you pointed out, well, isn't there another one? Like patience, that seems like a really odd one. And then I kind of thought to myself the same thing, like what is it about patience that heals wrath? And I thought to myself as I looked more into it and kind of just looked at what patience is and what wrath is, it actually makes perfect sense. Because without patience, wrath comes into play. Because when you look at patience, patience always thinks before it acts. And then you look at what happened between the Hatfields and McCoys, and there is none of that. Like it's just, oh, you did something wrong, or you're a Hatfield or you're a McCoy, so I'm going to kill you just because of that reason. So if there was patience involved between the two families, they could have settled their differences. They could have thought before they acted, and people could have been saved from being killed for no reason.
Yeah.
So when you really think about it, patience actually makes perfect sense as being the healing virtue of wrath, because it always seeks to understand. And when you look at the two families, there was, like I said, none of that. It was just, I hate you, so I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
I think wrath is always our first gut reaction, right? I mean, someone does something to offend us, that's our first thought, and just as human beings, as flawed human beings. And I think patience is something we, like you say, Scott, we have to work at. We have to say, no, I'm going to push wrath aside, push vengeance, wrath, justice, in air quotes, what I think justice is, and seek, patience, understanding. And I think, these families had a lot in common. And if they would have sought to understand, okay, why are you so upset? And here's why I'm so upset. Can the two patriarchs sit down at a table, drink some moonshine, and get over this and stop the killing? I think that really could have happened. Sadly, it didn't.
Yeah.
As
and you also have to look at the story within the context of its time period.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just after the Civil War, and which was arguably the most divided our country has ever been. So you bet that there was a lot of animosity left over from that between the two families, even though a lot of them were supporting the same side. But so looking at it within the historical context, it does kind of help you understand where some of that animosity came from, because we look at it now and we think it's just totally pointless that these families hated each other so much. But you look at it and you can kind of understand a little bit, but then you also understand, like you were saying, Jamie, what could they have done to end all of that? And they never did.
Yeah. You almost think about, like, nowadays, some say that we are in a cold civil war now. And I think in some ways we might be. Maybe there aren't guns firing, but there's definitely a war going on of ideas and kind of lifestyles. And in today's modern world, it's so easy to get back at someone, to, over social media, or to smear them publicly, or just a myriad of things. And so I think we do see wrath, kind of played out sometimes in our public square, like, oh, Kim Kardashian versus Kanye West, or something like that. Or just we see these things play out right in front of us, and we're like, man, like this person has a serious grudge, and it's so easily accessible that, we can watch it happen in real time. So I like that one. That was a cool one. But let's do our next one here. Go ahead, Jamie.
I was just going to say, I think with social media, I think wrath comes easier than it ever has.
Yeah.
You say things in a wrathful tone and a wrathful response. It's so easy. You just
type it out and it's gone, and it's on the internet for all to see. If you were standing face to face with that person, would you really have said that to him? Probably not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. It is dangerous, and you really need to watch what you say, whether it be in person or online.
Yep.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned social media. I mean, I'm thinking pride, greed, wrath, lust, gluttony, envy, sloth, like all these. I'm like, oh man, it's social media just kind of is in step with each one of these things.
Yeah. What's your TikTok algorithm showing you these days?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. All
Yeah,
right. What's the next
maybe
one?
next season, Scott will do social media for all seven deadly sins. Deadly sins.
Exactly. You pick a
Yeah,
social
this
media.
episode- This
Personality.
episode sin is TikTok.
Yeah. So lust. Speaking of TikTok or social media, this lust is all over, especially Instagram these days. So Jamie, I'll have to say that this was my favorite one. I know Scott, yours were good too, brother, but lust was my favorite one. I think you guys did a poll, and this ended up being
we did
the favorite one too. Wasn't it? Was it the favorite?
Yeah, it was a favorite. This one was a favorite. It was pretty close. It was pretty close with the other ones. They all got a lot of similar votage, but this one was the favorite for sure.
The polls are totally rigged, but
it's just such a relatable story that we've heard from childhood, really, and it just like hits so close to home.
But
so.
I really like one monologue you had in there when you were talking about he was able to defeat all the Philistines. And
let's play it before you get into that.
Okay. All right. You're right. Here we go.
Welcome to episode 4, The Lust of King David. This episode's sin is lust. Lust is the overwhelming desire for something that yields physical gratification. The object of one's lust is often forbidden or considered deviant. The desire most thought of when considering lust is that of a sexual nature. Nearly every man can relate to this kind of lust because most have fallen prey to and continue to battle against it. Lust for sexual gratification is a sin that can seem innocent to start, but often descends down a slippery slope that can end in relational loss, termination of employment, financial ruin, and even death. We can easily consider some of the most obvious examples of lust, but often ignore the temptation festering in our own minds and how we are just one step away from falling into its clutches. One man who succumbed to such a trap was the most celebrated leader of the ancient kingdom of Israel, King David. In this episode, we'll explore what led to his rise to power and how he nearly threw it all away when he allowed lustful temptation to get control of him.
Yeah, so a story many of us know, and it's just kind of powerful to just hear all that, and then you, like I was saying earlier, you had a monologue in there where you talk about how David was able to defeat Goliath, able to defeat so many things, but his Goliath was lust, and he couldn't defeat that. Loved it.
The giant that slew David was lust.
Yes.
It's funny. You say we've heard this since childhood. I heard this story at church this morning, and I was kind of thinking about I knew we were doing this tonight, and I was kind of thinking about it, and I really, it's as you say, a story we all know, and I chose this for obvious reasons. It's maybe one of the most well known stories of lust. These famous people who have kind of fallen prey to it, but I enjoyed putting kind of a theatrical spin on it, if you will, and that's kind of how we do our episodes. And I love doing stories we know, and then adding in sound effects, music, and kind of putting you in that same place this man was. And kind of the beginning, we always have a theatrical intro we call them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where David is on the roof, and we can read, you read those stories, and it can be easy just to gloss over the fine details of them. Where was David? He was on the roof. Why was he there? Well, he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been anywhere near the palace where he was. He should have been leading his men, but he wasn't. And Scott, we talked about this in Loose and Unscripted, that's sloth right there. He should have been fighting with his men, but he got lazy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, pride and greed of seeing this beautiful woman, and well, I'm the king, so I can have whatever I want.
Yeah.
And also just that split second that we can all relate to of seeing something, alluring, and instead of turning around, stopping yourself from going there, he didn't. He stumbled, and what that can lead to, and in David's case, obviously the death of an innocent man. So very very poignant, I guess, example of that. One that you said, as you said, we all know, and I had fun with it. It was also a challenging episode, I think, because David's known as this hero in biblical history, and also I think it is important, though, to not just focus on those things. It's important to see where these men fell, because I think we can learn more from that than their triumphs. How did these just Goliaths of not, no pun intended, these men of history who just are so famous for what they did, the good they did, how did they stumble so hard on something so simple? And it's an example of how it can happen to all of us.
Yeah. And similarly for King Solomon, right? You talked about him.
Yes, yeah, we kind of ended with that, where he was King David's son, and he went through a lot of the same things, and even more. It was magnified.
Wives,
He had hundreds of wives, hundreds of concubines, and he just fell into the exact same trap that his dad did.
Yeah. I like that.
It's also it's interesting too, looking at both of their stories though, and how they both came to see the futility and the waste of all of it. Whereas with King David, you have, if you look at Psalm 51, that is a chronicle of his repentance of that sin of lust with Bathsheba. And I mean, it's really beautiful when you read it, though, because it's so honest and heartfelt that you really get the sense that he saw the weight of what he did and how it affected so many people around him. And then you have Solomon with the book of Ecclesiastes, where, he's an old man reflecting on his life, and he realizes that was just a waste. I mean, what a waste. So you definitely get the sense that they both had the same they both had the same flaw of lust, but you get the sense that they both learned from it in their own way.
Yeah. So what's the corresponding virtue to lust?
Yeah, so the corresponding virtue is love. Go figure. I think it's an easy one, because love is very much the opposite, because lust looks at, if we look at those two words, lust and love, in the context of of sex and relationships, lust is seeking that for yourself, not considering the other person, just seeking your own pleasure and your own in whatever you want to get from that relationship. Whereas love, it's seeking that pleasure as well, and that relationship, but also considering, well, what does the other person need, and how do their needs come before my needs? How can their needs be fulfilled in this, and even at the expense of my own? So I quoted, kind of paraphrased 1 Corinthians 13 in the ending of the episode, kind of where Paul lays out what love is: patience, kindness, no, not envy. There's another deadly sin.
Yeah. Not
being boastful, kind of pride. That's not arrogant or rude, irritable or resentful. So it very much is the opposite of lust, and the opposite of what got David into that scenario.
Love it, man. That was a great episode.
Thank you.
Let's hit that next one, Ethan. You want me to?
Yeah, so the next one is gluttony. And this one had a really interesting story that I think was maybe there wasn't tons of details on it, but it was you guys kind of
straight out of Scott's mind.
Yes, spelled it out really well, and kind of developed a little bit of the the little bit of historical information that you had versus kind of adding to it and making it even better. So gluttony. Go ahead, Jared.
Welcome to episode 5, The Gluttony of Reginald III. This episode's sin is gluttony. Gluttony is the overconsumption of food and drink to the detriment of the consumer and those less fortunate. A gluttonous man hoards for himself what he could give to others. It is a sin defined by materialism, hedonism, and a belief that there is only the eternal present. When describing the behavior of the wicked, the Bible's book of Philippians proclaims that their stomach is their God. While a gluttonous man is many things, he is, above all else, a worshipper of idols. One such example of this destructive vice is the little-known Reginald III, a man whose tragic tale graphically reveals what happens when we refuse to refrain from good things that can also destroy us. Due to scant historical information, this episode is based loosely on true events.
Yeah, so maybe kind of want to break the story down quickly, a little bit of kind of what happened there.
Yeah, so this is a story that I remembered from high school of all places. And it was used, I don't remember if it was a teacher or a pastor or someone in that role of just using it as an example about becoming a prisoner of your own appetite. And that story always stuck with me. And I knew it was based on an actual historical figure. So when it came time to do boom, I got to do this person. I don't know anything about them, but I'm going to research it. And it turned out to be this really obscure ruler in England, in a small duchy, or
in Holland.
Yeah, in Holland, I think it was. Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, not really much information about him. I'm guessing he was probably one of those people who didn't really do much that was worthy of note. So at that time, they were probably thinking, yeah, we don't really need to talk about him. He didn't really do much. But just this one particular aspect about him where he was just, as rotund as you could possibly get, I imagine.
Yeah, so a massive guy that was just so gluttonous and eating everything, and is between two brothers, one of they kind of feuded, right? And then the one brother put the other brother in a room with an open door and fed him as much as he possibly could eat with an open door, saying you can leave anytime you fit through that door. And fit through the door he did not.
He became a prisoner of his own eating.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things where it seems really extreme, but it's also very profound and sad when you read about it, where you think he so easily could have gotten out of that room, but his brother knew him all too well, and you definitely get a sense that there was a huge amount of animosity between the two brothers. I mean, a brother doesn't do something like that if he is on good terms with his brother. So
yeah,
I felt like that was the angle that I could approach the episode from, was kind of setting it within the context of these two brothers going at it.
This is one of the ones that to me seemed very like habit forming, right? And so it could have just been, I mean, if he would have potentially just not eaten or cut what he was eating in half or whatever else, like potentially he had 100% control over his situation, but his addiction controlled him. How many times in our life, whether it's, maybe somebody is struggling with an addiction to drugs, or even to smoking, or even to, I don't know, pornography or whatever it might be. People have these addictions that just kind of consume people's lives, and they get so bad to where you are the person that can get yourself out of it, but it's almost like you don't have the strength to do it, which is just really interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what's interesting about gluttony as a sin is that for some people it's obvious, because you just look at their bodies and you go, wow, okay, clearly that person has an eating problem, but for the average Joe, like us right here, we're clearly not of the sumo variety, but but we could easily fall into that sin very subtly, where you just get this idea of, oh, what's one more piece of cake? What's one more steak? What's one more this? What's that going to do? But then you look at it and you think, well, someone else could have that. Instead, I'm taking it for myself. So looking at gluttony from that perspective, it was very fascinating as I was doing the episode of just thinking, wow, I never really looked at gluttony as having that kind of an effect on other people, because you think gluttony is more just you're sinning against yourself. But no, you are sinning against other people by being gluttonous, because that's stuff that they could take for themselves that you're taking for yourself.
Yeah, and that potentially potentially could help their lives, but you have so much that you just want more. To me, it kind of went along really well with greed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But more of like a physical sense of, gluttony, overindulgent.
Well, I think of like gluttony of the mind, like mindless scrolling, or just like, binging on Netflix, just this gluttonous, I have to watch the next episode, or just keep scrolling just to try to numb out your senses. It's a very similar way. Maybe you don't wear that on your body and it's not that visible, but sometimes it, that can also be gluttony, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it's just your body size, right? It's so much more. It's even if you don't struggle with that your eating doesn't really show up in those ways. Your eating could still be a problem. You could be eating really unhealthily, and you might be fine for a while, but people drop dead of heart attacks every day, and they may have looked completely healthy before that. And so I think gluttony is one where you can look at it and say, oh, that's not an issue for me, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we just not even consider that as ever being an issue for ourselves, because it is. Are you eating more, or even just eating really unhealthily, and you could be taking better care of yourself? I think we're all in that boat. So it's gluttony is certainly something that we shouldn't ignore.
Yeah, and that one kind of went with like the whole social media thing we're talking about, and not just like Facebook or TikTok or whatever else, but just overindulgence of something. It's if you're gonna sit there for a little bit and watch YouTube videos or scroll through whatever, but if you're if you lose your job because you can't put your phone down, or because you're just scrolling mindlessly through social media, I mean, you're just like overindulgence of something that could potentially be a good thing. Food and sustenance is a good thing, but an overabundance, it can really ruin your situation.
So I'm thinking the corresponding virtue is discipline here. Would that be accurate?
The one that I used in the episode was temperance.
Okay, yeah,
but I think that could work too. I think discipline could work too. Yeah, I mean, we tend to think of temperance in relation to alcohol, but I've never looked at it strictly in those terms. I think it applies to the same thing that discipline does.
Well, temperate means being just moderate with your intake, and moderate or disciplined. Those are, you can say they're synonymous, but I like temperance too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where you look at what you have and you say, am I going to go there, or am I not going to? It's very similar to David's incident on the roof. Am I going to take this for myself, or am I just going to move on?
Yeah.
So it's just it all, or you could just say self-control at the end, because that's really what it comes down to. If you have self-control, then you're not going to be the size of a semi-truck. So.
All right, let's do envy next. This was yours, Jamie. Is that right?
Yep, this was mine.
All right, let's go ahead and roll this clip here.
Welcome to episode 6, The Envy of Benedict Arnold. This episode's sin is envy. Envy is a deep-seated discontentment with what one has when compared to others. It is a sin that combines feelings of covetousness, jealousy, and selfishness. Although it is something often concealed in the mind, hidden by subtle remarks or passive-aggressive comments, it can eventually give birth to a whole host of other sins. The envious man can never show genuine happiness for the success of others, because he is always left comparing it to himself and questioning its merit, always seeing it as a slight against himself. One of history's most devastating examples of envy is perhaps America's greatest hero turned villain, Benedict Arnold. In this episode, we'll delve into his life as an American patriot during the Revolutionary War, how he rose through the ranks to become one of George Washington's most trusted generals, and how his envy led him to betray the country he had once fought so hard to defend.
What made you choose Benedict Arnold?
Yeah, this one actually, it was tough to pick one because I had a few that I was thinking about.
What were some of the other ones you were thinking about?
I was thinking about Vladimir Lenin, for sure. Envy, just the whole communism thing, the whole concept of communism is very envious. And then I read an article about Benedict Arnold, and it really fascinated me that he was like a really high up general, in the Continental Army. He was kind of loved by George Washington. He was supported by him, even when others were kind of trying to push him out, there's a lot of politics going on. George Washington really stuck by him until the end, until he decided to betray the country. But it was just a really interesting story of a guy who could have, he did a lot for the country. He was a brave soldier, a great leader, military leader, and he could have even went on to become, who knows, he could have even become president someday. And he just threw it all away because he got envious of really the other generals in the army. They were getting promoted before him. He felt like he should have been that guy and that he deserved it more. And it really hits at envy, because envy really is not being able to be satisfied and not ever being able to be happy for anyone else for what they may achieve or get, and wanting that all for yourself. And I put this quote in there. It's actually it's in the conclusion of the episode. Benjamin Franklin said of Arnold, Judas sold only one man, Arnold sold 3 million. Meaning that the population of the country back then.
Well, it wasn't just it wasn't that one man that was pretty important.
he was pretty important, yeah. But kind of a quirky, tongue-in-cheek thing. But
yeah.
I thought that was pretty clever from Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah. This was
a witty one.
This was the one where you, at the end, you had like a poem or something that I think.
Yeah, the poem.
Scott, you read.
Scott actually read it. That poem I found. I think I was actually listening to a documentary or watching a documentary on Arnold, and it had that poem at the beginning. I never was able to find the exact source. All I could figure was this appeared in some news article after Arnold had betrayed the country, and obviously all the news articles were telling people the story. That's how people got their news back then. And someone had written this really just piercing poem directed towards him. And yeah, you should go listen to the episode, listeners.
Yeah.
It's a good one. Scott did a good job reading it.
Yeah,
I never get the meaty lines. I never get the really big poetic epic moments. So I definitely milked it for all it was worth.
I was kind of like, oh, this is a great episode, and then at the end I was like, oh, wait, what is this? This is a surprise. And then it was Scott, talking about sharing the poem. At first I was like, what is this? What is going on? What is this? And then I was like, oh, nice. So
yeah, I thought we'd throw that in there, just a way to. It gets the feeling of how everyone felt about his betrayal, because it was such a slap in the face, because he was so high up and so well thought of by a lot of people in America at the time.
So how do we combat?
Well, I think you
go ahead.
Well, I think you mentioned too, Jamie, I think in Loose and Unscripted, that I thought was a very good point, where had he not committed the sin of envy and gone that route, he probably would be remembered as a hero today.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But because of that, we only think of him as a traitor. We don't think of any of his achievements before then.
Yeah.
So it's another one of those things about just history and the sins in general, is that we remember these people because of these things when they did have a lot of good qualities, and yet because of these sins and how much it affected those around them, that's all we think about them now.
Yeah.
So it's just very, very fascinating looking at it from a historical standpoint.
Yeah, history was not kind to him, for sure.
And what's the corresponding virtue for envy?
The corresponding virtue was generosity. It's just, being generous for others, meaning not always wanting the best for yourself. A lot of other generals got promoted, and instead of, being happy for them, I understand that it's just like the workplace, right? Someone gets promoted and you're like, oh, congratulations, but and I think that's where we can learn a lesson from this kind of story. Is that your first thought when someone gets promoted in the same kind of area of even where you work? Are you actually happy for them, or is there that ping of, oh man, I'm kind of envious of that? And how do we do, heart surgery on ourselves? How do we say, why do I feel that way? Why is that my first instinct to feel envious? And how do I bring myself to be happy for them and, be generous for there was only so many places that they could promote people into to be a general. And, he, for whatever reason, got passed up, whether it be, it was most likely, probably he deserved it, but it didn't happen. And instead of saying, okay, well, what can I do to further prove myself, he just got bitter about it. And instead of having generosity and saying, okay, well, it wasn't me this time. And I say in the episode, so a generous person, he practices the feast over famine mentality, meaning there's always another chance.
Mm-hmm.
There's always another chance for me, even if it's not, going back to the work analogy, even if it's not this company.
Yep.
There's another chance for me out there, and not to get bitter, because once you get bitter, then it's just a downfall from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really important in the feast over famine mentality. And there's a lot of times, and I will self-admittedly, for example, like sports personnel, like people that play sports and they're making, hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever else. I look at that and I'm like, man, all they're doing is just like throwing a football or just kicking a soccer ball, and they're making all this money, and I'm, doing this and this and that or whatever. Not that they don't work hard for it, but I'm like, is that really contributing to society? And, they're making all this money and I'm whatever. Well, them making all this money doesn't take money out of my pocket at all. And so, and so it's just, it's interesting. I think that's definitely cool. That kind of brings us to the last one here is slothfulness. This is something that is really interesting to me, and the story is kind of one that is a fictional story, right, Scott? And so it kind of brought it home a little bit. But Jared, let's go ahead and play the sloth one, and then we'll get into it.
Okay.
Welcome to episode 7, The Sloth of Lord Denethor. This episode's sin is sloth. Sloth, perhaps better known today as laziness or idleness, is unique in that it is not defined by evil actions, but rather by inaction. A slothful man may well be aware the harm being done to his family, friends, community, or country, yet will ultimately refuse to do what is needed to bring about change. A slothful man scoffs at hard work out of concern that the borders of his comfort zones will be violated. Because of his belief that he can do nothing to fix the problems around him, he allows fear and vice to be his masters. Perhaps most horribly of all, a slothful man refuses to offer his strength to a world that desperately needs it. One of literature's most striking examples of sloth is Lord Denethor, a character featured in J.R.R. Tolkien's epic masterwork, The Lord of the Rings. When he experiences a great loss, He becomes so overwhelmed with his own emotions that the city he leads grows more and more vulnerable to the greatest evil of the age.
My favorite part of that is slothfulness is not defined really by inaction, but more inaction. I thought that was really really cool. So Scott, what kind of made you think about this character?
Well, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the films, are my favorite film of all time, without question, hands down. Nothing else even comes close. So, and it was another one of those ones where, looking at historical examples, it's pretty difficult to come up with one. Although I'm sure you could probably find one if you really dug deep. But I thought to myself, well, I don't think we've done a fictional one yet. So, fiction can teach us just as much as history, and who better than Denethor? And that's the one that came to mind. Was, wow, how do you, in his inaction, led to all this destruction? So I think that's another thing where sloth is kind of the one that stands out differently from the other sins. And like you said, it's defined not by what you do, but by what you don't do, and how by not doing things you have the same effect that the other sins have by what you do. So it's a very fascinating concept where inaction can lead to destruction as much as action.
I think about one thing I was reading about sloth is that, the original, when these original folks like the Evagaris Ponticus wrote this. He was a monk. He was really gearing this towards monks at the beginning, and sloth was almost like slothfulness in keeping the commandments, or like doing the things that you should be doing, like praying and like studying and like nourishing yourself spiritually. And so I think if you can think about it like that, and like, are we being slothful in the way that we follow God, whatever way that may be for you, and not just like, are you being a lazy dad? I think that's like, or are you being a lazy employee? Are you not giving to your employer what you say you're giving in regards to time? So then there's so many different ways to view this virtue, and also this was one of the ones that they kind of attributed with sadness, and like.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, and you look at the story that Tolkien wrote, and
yeah,
I mean, the character is portrayed a lot less sympathetically in the films than the novels. Like in the novels, you can really sympathize with the character, and in the films, he's kind of portrayed as being driven mad by what he's gone through, or that he always kind of had that madness. But, and maybe that's true, I don't know. But I haven't read the trilogy in a while. But in doing research for it, looking back over the story that Tolkien wrote, is you see these incidents that happen in his life of great loss, where he loses his wife and then he loses his son, and those losses just gradually chip away at his soul and his resolve to the point where that's all he knows.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, his entire kingdom suffers. And I think the films do a really great job of portraying that, where there's a line where where one of the soldiers says to Gandalf, he's seen this doom forever, this city that he was supposed to defend. He knew this was coming, and then Gandalf just says he foresaw it and did nothing. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but basically that's what he says. He foresaw it, he knew it was a possibility, and he did nothing about it because he's so overwhelmed by his feelings and emotions. And I think if there's one defining virtue or defining sin among men today, it's probably this one, if you ask me. Lust probably could be another one, but I think this is probably the biggest one because it's often out of sloth that these other sins come to play. There's so many men these days, they just do nothing with their lives. They do nothing with their time of note. They just waste away, and they don't think of themselves as having any strength to offer the world, when in reality, every man has strength to offer the world. It's just that no one has prompted them in that direction. So it was a particularly meaningful episode for me in that sense of just feeling like, wow, this speaks to so many men today. And it filled me kind of with sadness, because how many men today don't have people in their lives telling them, you do have strength. You can offer this to the world. So get off your butt and do it.
Yeah.
Stop wasting your time.
So, what virtue can we cultivate to combat this sin?
The one that I chose was diligence. Well, I say I chose it. I actually got it from a list that some other religious figures had come up with. So I didn't come up with that. But yeah, I'm no monk. But so and diligence too is the very opposite of sloth, in that diligence is one of those virtues that is defined solely by what you do. I think a lot of virtues are very much a mindset or a heart mentality, but diligence is all about action. Like, we are not wasting time. We're not going to linger over what might have been. We are going to act, and we are going to do things to make this right.
Get it
and then
done.
you look at the story of Denethor and his downfall in that story, and you see full well, yeah, well, if he was diligent, he could have done a lot more for his kingdom. And you could argue that his kingdom was going to be under threat no matter what, and that's very much true. But think of how much that threat would have been mitigated had he been diligent and not wasted his time in sorrow.
I think this is one that I sometimes feel like, I don't know, a fear that I may be guilty of. Maybe that's just because of my personality. I'm always like trying to drive. I'm a driver, and so when I relax a little bit, I'm like, oh, I'm being slothful, But I think part of it is like that. It's not the commission part, like me just lazing around the house. Really, the part of the sin that I feel like I might be guilty of sometimes is the omission part. I think we're at a time in our country where so many of our freedoms are being eroded, and there's so much stuff going on. I feel like in some cases I feel totally helpless as to what's going on with this country, and I'm just like, do I really want my kids to grow up in a country like this, or should I just move it to the middle of the woods somewhere and just raise them, homeschool them independently and just do my own thing? So I'm like, as a man, how do I stand up? How do I stand up to this society and try to make a better world? Obviously, I'm trying to do that through the podcast, trying to do that in interactions with everybody on a daily basis. But is that enough? Should I be doing more? And that's kind of what sometimes plagues me when I lay my head down to sleep at night. That's what plagues me.
Yeah, I think it should. I think it should plague us. I think that should be the thought on all our minds as man. What are we not? What things are going on in our lives that we are not doing something about? Everybody has something that they're struggling with, something that's not, maybe the way it should be. Okay, but what are you doing about it? What steps are you taking to make it better? And maybe you can't fix it. Maybe it's something that can't be fixed, but are you just doing nothing? And I think that the Denethor character in the trilogy, it's a really, I think it's possibly one of the most relatable, because we all fall prey to that. We see these big, huge problems and we just freeze and we say, well, I can't fix it, so I might as well just do nothing. And at the other side of that, the character of Aragorn, who is this guy who is very humble, and he doesn't think he can fix it. He says, well, I can't fix it, but he doesn't just stop and say, well, I'm just going to do nothing. He takes the steps and uses his skills, and then he becomes king, and he does resolve it. He does fix it. So I think those two characters are we can pull a lot of lessons from them. As you say, Scott, it's not just true stories that can teach us things. Fiction can as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be real in order for us to learn from it.
Totally. Well, guys, we've covered all the 7 deadly sins. I think this has been a great discussion. I'd encourage all the listeners to go and listen to this mini-series. They're short episodes. If you listen to it on 2 times speed, it's done in like 7 minutes. So that's usually how I listen to podcasts nowadays.
And we'll sound a lot funnier too.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a good point. I would suggest listening on maybe nothing higher than 1.2. Because the audio on these is really cool, and it's very theatrical. So if you go too fast, you'll miss the theatrics, which is
and if you're going for humor, listen to us on half speed. That is really funny.
Okay.
You'd be like, the healing virtue is diligence.
Well, nowadays, when I listen to people on regular speed, I feel like I'm listening to them on half speed. It's weird. I listened to
that is
all.
strange. You should get that looked at.
I listened to the whole book of Atlas Shrugged on like 2.2 speed because it was like a 9-hour book, and I was like, oh man, I gotta get through it faster.
Can't do 9 hours.
So I was listening to it just lightning speed, and then I would occasionally taper it back so I could really hear the good parts, in just regular time. And I was like, man, it feels like they're just dragging this on.
I know that's one of the major criticisms of Ayn Rand's writing is just the clunkiest prose imaginable.
So, well, thanks everyone. Appreciate you guys coming. This has been a great episode. It's been a great way for us to build our creed. That's what we're all about. And I know you guys are about building those virtues. So we are a great team together.
Yeah, thanks for having us on again, guys. Go listen to Seven Deadly Sins. We've also got an episode coming out, or a new season coming out here that it may have some voices that our Brothers Creed podcast listeners might recognize.
Indeed.
Be prepared.
It'd be great.
Yes. So, all right, guys. Take care. Thanks.
All right.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.